What's going on, boyos? I just got to the accessory portion of today's workout, which went quite well, by the way. I actually got a new front squat PR of 545 pounds, which I might post on the YouTube at some point. I noticed that when I post 2 videos in a day, they do not do too good. So I might put that off for a day that I don't have a video planned. Just put my warm-ups for that. But my motivation reached a real peak to do the next exercises I think you should be doing, mostly because I'm doing accessory exercises right now. I've recently been kind of formatting my new block of training, so I've been putting a lot of thought into what do I feel like I need to check off. And I had 3 kind of points I wanted to touch on today, so we're gonna go through those in order. I don't want to get cold, I want to hit my accessories, so hopefully I don't ramble too much here, but let's get into it. Point 1, a little point I forgot to touch on, and I believe it was the first one of these where I was saying, hey, you should probably have a little unilateral volume present in your program. One of the #1 complaints people will have about doing unilateral leg volume is they feel they're limited by their work capacity more than they are limited by their musculature. And I very much view that to be a benefit of the exercise because at first, true. And because that's what you're limited by, that's what you're gonna get better at, and your work capacity will come up until your work capacity is such that you are limited by your musculature, and then you just need to maintain that. And that, I think, sets people up for a lot of squatting success, because if you're prepared to go do hard sets of lunges or split squats, you're also probably pretty prepared work capacity-wise to put in volume on the squat without your lungs being quite as much of a limiting factor. So I view it very much as, okay, at first it's challenging the wind, and then it's kind of a tool we have in our program to maintain some baseline level of work capacity / conditioning. So that was touching point 1. Touching point 2 was a little bonus exercise that I don't think needs to be in every program. I do think that it is a little underutilized, and that would be direct calf work, primarily for the purpose of ankle health and mobility. Now, it's kind of become more popular nowadays to say, well, you don't necessarily need a static stretch. We have good evidence to suggest that just resistance training through a full range of motion is just as, if not more, efficacious for improving our flexibility. So people would say, oh, well, don't just touch your toes, go do RDLs. And for some reason, that same line of thought isn't necessarily applied to the ankles. It seems that the ankles are construed as unique, and that we do need to do all this stretching and do all these mobility drills and banded distractions if we want to have great ankle mobility. So what I would say is for many people, just squatting regularly, squatting deep, warming up gradually, that's enough to load that ankle dorsiflexion and improve and maintain it. Although for some people that doesn't seem to be enough to get the ball rolling. And while we could implement some static stretching modalities to kind of assist us into getting into that position and then use the squat to load it, we could also apply that same principle of, oh, if we wanted more flexible hamstrings, doing deep RDLs is probably a great use of time. Well, if we want flexible ankles, doing a bit of direct calf work just to warm them up and kind of strengthen through that full range of motion is one of the most potent things you can do on a minute-to-minute basis. It doesn't take much time. You can just superset it with whatever you like to do before you squat. It's kind of an old school bodybuilding trick. They say, oh, make sure you always hit your calves, whether it's seated, standing, single leg, whatever it is, before you squat to loosen up your ankles, then your knees take less of a beating. And there's a little bit of truth there. I would go so far as to say there's a lot of bit of truth there. Just a simple exercise ordering of throwing the calves at the beginning. A, you can kind of check this muscle group that you kind of were guilty for not training, and B, I think, and more importantly, we also kind of get that additional benefit of getting the ankles strengthened through a full ROM, and then we're probably going to be able to squat to ass to grass without as much movement prep. I think there's tons of people that don't necessarily need to do these to have healthy mobile ankles, but if that's something you struggle with, I think that's a very easy intervention. And then 3 is the actual exercises I think should probably be in your program. The name 2 would probably be either a glute ham raise back extension, so where you're parallel to the floor, or a 45-degree back extension. But I think that this could be extended to a bunch of different motions that all lend themselves to running up more hip hinging volume, more than a deadlift might, more than a good morning might, more than even an RDL might, because while those do lend themselves to volume better than dead stop pulls from the floor, compared to some exercises, they aren't quite as easy to recover from running up a ton of volume. So these lower scale hip hinging movements are something that I think holds a lot of value. Other things that we could probably put in this category would be like the back attack machine, reverse hypers, to some degree, any kind of pull through or hip thrust, I think would also be hip hinging that we can run up a bunch of volume. Both Both of those options would be more or less entirely low back sparing. So in some ways that might be less of a benefit because we're kind of missing key components of developing our posterior chain. But in some ways that could be a benefit. If we are truly fried and it's the only hinging we can fit in is something like a hip thrust, we might benefit from that. And the reason that these are so potent, right? Back in the day, West Side guys, yes, they were in suits. Squat to suit is very much a different lift than a raw squat, but they would always go on and on and on about the importance of doing everything you can to have the strongest posterior chain you can. And while I think they missed the ball in saying that quads aren't important, in which case they are very important, I do think there's tons of benefits to having a very, very strong posterior chain. It's very likely to help your overhead to some degree, your deadlift to a huge degree, and definitely your squat to some degree. So it's one of those things that doing it is going to help a lot of things. And so we can easily justify that bit of training economy in our program. The pure hip hinge is a skill that's less common in athletics. So even if you do have an athletic background, you might not be comfortable with this pure hinging pattern. You might feel pretty comfortable squatting, push pressing, bench pressing. All these things kind of feel natural, but a pure hip hinge just isn't something you ever really did in your sport. Many sports will tell you to avoid this and try to squat into whatever motion you're in more to maintain your upright posture. So it's definitely something that people don't have a lot of history on, but it is a very, very foundational skill for strength training. I cannot understate how much of just mastering a hip hinge, getting good at lifting is. So what most athletes need to do is find ways to catch up. They're like, okay, well, I'm 20 years old. I started lifting last year. I've only done 1,000 hip hinges ever in my life. If I really want to develop the musculature associated with a hip hinge and really master that mechanic, I want to run up that number quickly. And while I am doing as much deadlifting and RDLs and squatting as I can, I would like to run that number up a little bit quicker if I can. And that's where these other hinging variations that are less taxing and lend themselves to tons of volume can be helpful to really develop all of that muscle that we need to have a strong hip hinge. Usually, most programs I write, they'll be somewhere in there. Sometimes I feel that's not necessary for the athlete. Definitely happens. But most of the time you're going to see a glute ham raise back extension, a 45-degree back extension. If someone likes it, I'll throw a glute ham raise in there. I mean, not glute ham raise, I'm sorry. A reverse hyper in there. Not as big of a fan of those because they're hard to quantify with how much you're swinging, but if you like them, they make your back feel nice, absolutely fill up some of your hinging volume with that. The fact that they make your back feel nice is a good enough reason, and it's not like they don't work, right? So we have tons of options. Those kind of be the first three I throw out there. Sometimes a hip thrust would be good for doing tons of volume. Someone who never feels their glutes contributing to when they're squatting or when they're deadlifting, doing some glute-centric hinging like a pull-through, which once you get strong, pull-throughs get pretty difficult to load heavy enough to do even like a set of 30 on. So we might move to a hip thrust. Can be a good way to do glute-centric hinging volume to kind of help develop that skill. But I would say all of these have a time and a place. Also the back attack machine, very rare machine. If your gym has one, I envy you. I would love to hop on one of those. Seems like a great exercise. It's just a if you think about the strength curve of one, you could look it up if you don't know what it looks like. It's basically a really easy way to load a back extension. You're up and down. There's like a pad against the back of your neck. You hinge, you go back, but it's basically an identical motion to a back extension, just with the ability to load up a lot of weight with time. If this little garage I had was a lot bigger, I would definitely buy one eventually. I think they're pretty cool. But yeah, that would be my thing. I would make sure it's in your program. We just need to run up that hinging volume because it's something we've done a lot less of in our life. Usually that's a lagging component of people's musculature that they're going to benefit a lot from bringing up.